Okay, today we're going to talk about professional ethics and legal liability. And so in this course, not only will we talk about ethics, we're not going to go into the classical theories. In this case, we're actually going to go in and look at some of the more recent provisions that have arisen, concerns that have arisen about ethical matters in business, and talk about some of the threats and some of the safeguards that have been put in place. So, it all really started a few years ago when there was a crash of big corporations in 2002. Enron and 30 other firms were seriously in debt. These were large firms, and there was a lot of money lost. And it became clear that there was certainly ethical violations, and it turned out there were also legal violations of the then law. But we actually enacted another law called Sarbanes-Oxley, which provided some safeguards. And ever since then, I think we've been chipping away at the safeguards. Okay, so they're not popular with the people who are regulated. Anyway, professional ethics and legal liability. So we'll talk about the common law, we'll talk about securities law, we'll talk about private securities lawsuits and criminal prosecutions, because it's all in line with regulations, which is what we're talking about in this part of the course. So this is getting pretty down near the end, and we're going to switch over to strictly ethics. But ethics is sort of a prelude to some of the reforms that came about. So we'll talk about ethics at first. So anyway, what are the ethical principles that are addressed by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was a SOC Act that was passed in response to the destruction of wealth that occurred because shareholders had been misled as to the fortune of and the success of certain corporations like Enron. They were over-reporting income. They were reporting income they didn't have and using accounting techniques. And in that, they were largely aided, oftentimes, by their independent auditors. Independent auditors had done a fairly good job since the early 30s with the passage of the New Deal Act regulating securities over the stock exchanges. We had a long period where we didn't really have as many financial scandals, and the ones we had were not as severe. And I think this was largely due to the accountants of the era, who originally, before 1933, accountants' main jobs were usually working for banks, and banks wanted to know whether or not they should lend money to somebody, and therefore they would rate the accountants. And the accountants who too easily gave a company a buy, accountants that were corrupt, accountants that didn't do the auditing job correctly, were not favored. And so if you were like Arthur Andersen and incorruptible, you were highly favored. So if you've got your audit from Arthur Andersen, that was like gold. Then the bank would say, yeah, we can lend money. Arthur Andersen says you're good for it. and that would be what you need. So anyway, let's talk about these ethical principles now. One ethical principle is integrity. What do we mean by that? We mean conscientiousness. One of the biggest factors in life, if you want to be successful, and if you want to have a long life even, you need to be conscientious. That is, you need to pay attention to the task at hand. You need to be present in the moment and pay attention and do the things that you promise and be reliable. That's being conscientious. So integrity is important. Also, you could talk about integrity in terms of being frankness. Are you being candid? Are you being strictly honest with people? Are you volunteering information they need to know? I mean, this would be a very valuable quality in a person as a friend, right? If he would tell you things that you need to know. People then need to be receptive to that kind of thing, because oftentimes we don't like hearing the truth, right? And certainly leaders that we have need to know the truth, and oftentimes some of these leaders really bully and push people away who would tell them the truth, and that's unfortunate. And they wind up usually paying a price in terms of reputation for that. Because you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, as Abe Lincoln said. And so eventually we catch on to that, even the most dumbest of us after a while can realize that inconsistency and big fibs are what you're getting from certain of our politicians, and eventually they get turned out. And so that's what Lincoln said. Honesty is also tied with that integrity. You got to be honest both ways. Honest in terms of your response. It's very tempting when somebody who's important to you is a friend or as your boss or your spouse or even your child. It's very important for you to maybe have them love you and like you, and even be willing to do things for you, like give you a raise. And so it's very tempting. You don't need much to get people to comply and praise you and shield you from things that you should know. You actually need the honesty and the frankness that comes about by a person who's being conscientious. And we oftentimes don't appreciate those people in our lives, but we need to be that way. So anyway, that's integrity. Now another ethical principle is competency. If you have a job, you need to be prepared for that job. Are you an engineer? You need to know what engineers know. So how did you know that? Well, you went to school, maybe you served as an apprentice, maybe had a part-time job while while you were at school. That is, if you could find a summer job that allowed you to work in an office that did that kind of work, fine. And if you want to be a marketing person, the same way, you need to learn what marketing people learn in school, and you need to maybe gain some practical experience on the job whenever you can. Because even though you can learn everything there is to know in the book, there's nothing better than seeing how it plays out in practice. Unfortunately, sometimes in practice, what you find is that the people who are practicing are not being ethical. In a very competitive society like ours, that's a very danger, and that's an unfortunate kind of thing. So competency, you need to be prepared. So if I'm investing in a company, I want to know that the people there are competent, that they're prepared to do the job right, which means that they've got certification, right? So I think college education is not a guarantee that somebody's going to be competent, but certainly the fact that they've been certified and given a grade by their accounting professors gives me some confidence that maybe they are. That is, at least they've taken the time to go to school and engaged in an activity that should have resulted in them having a certain level of competence. And certainly, like I said, having a job really is a very vital part of that if they can get one. And of course, nowadays it's hard for people to get jobs, and good jobs are harder to find. Anyway, that's an unfortunate thing. And it also means you have to be skilled. So it's more than just knowing what the book said, more than just learning a bunch of definitions or being able to spot a laundry list. Okay, I always talk about laundry list. I mean, when I was in school, I would have professors that would give me laundry list of these things. Okay, these things are this, and and I think about that, and well, what was the use of learning these laundry lists? It's a memory trick. Well, I can do memory tricks very well apparently, but does that really mean I know much when I just know these words? It'd be more important for me to really understand how those words are applied or what they mean in real life, how it's understood in real life, and you only get that oftentimes by experiencing it. And so, if we could have some more demonstrations in school, if we could see like some virtual reality on that would be very good. But we don't get those kind of virtual reality programs, right? We get the Bachelorette, right? And I guess that's good if you're going to plan on having that kind of arrangement in your life. But I'd like to see more of that done in a more practical sense, but I don't know that's been done a lot. Anyway, skilled. So you need to acquire skills, and you get that in the right kind of courses in school, right? So I mean, this is, as I remember it, I think one area that was very good at that was accounting when I had accounting, because you had to do what was accounting work and turn those in and get graded on that. And so you began to understand what doing accounting was, even though you were only doing it in a school setting, because you were actually working on doing that. And you see this in a lot of things like that. I'm sure that if you're studying art, one of the things that I think art students do is they actually do art. And so they acquire knowledge of what that is, and it's firsthand. It's literally in their hand, the work that they do, and they get very harshly criticized sometimes by their professors. Some of that may be unfair. Some of it may represent prejudice and misinformation on the part of an older generation. Older generations are often nowadays very much ill-informed because they don't keep track of technological changes the way the younger people do. And that's because they're too busy with their life trying to keep up with the bills, trying to keep up with all the obligations they've got, and trying to be good people in the same process. And it's hard to actually keep up these new technical developments. In some sense, you have to unlearn old things that you learned before. And if you do keep up with it, you will find that they come out with a computer, you learn all about the computer, and then they come out with a new one, and it's totally different. The language of the computer has changed, and this code, there's a lot of things you don't need to know now that you knew, and there's other things you need to know you don't know, and you got to learn it all over again. So this is why any sort of technical thing like that, engineers oftentimes need to go in for updates and for re-education, you would say, we call it, keeping their professional competence up. So we'd like to have that. So competence, you need to be skilled, you need to be trained, you need to keep up with that throughout your career. Due care. Due care is reasonable diligence, that is, taking the steps you need to do in order to do your job right. So it's sort of a high level of not being negligent. It's a level of where you not only look to not do anything wrong, but you look to see what might be going wrong that you should fix. So in a lot of businesses, part of the problem is fixing problems that arise. Well, part of that, one of the issues is recognizing when a problem is developing, because if you can catch it early, usually it's easier to solve it. Okay, so being trained is a very important thing, and you get trained on the job, and you learn how to be diligent on your job by experience also. Discreetness, that's an ethical issue, because if you are taking a job as an accountant, as a lawyer, as a clerk in a store, in any kind of job, you're working as a cashier in a bank, in a savings and loan, and you find information about people that's not meant to be public. So a cashier, I worked as a cashier one Christmas as a part-time kind of person, and I was working, and I was actually going through and putting into the machine the payments that people were making on their houses. And I could see if certain persons were actually in default, didn't pay their money this time, and I knew this information. In some cases, I actually knew the people because it was in a community I was from, and so I could not reveal that to anyone, and I realized that. I don't know where I learned that, but I learned that there's a need to keep confidential information that you learn while on a job, whether it's a lawyer or an accountant, a cashier, whatever your job, whether you're waiting tables and you find out personal information. It's an ethical issue. You really don't need to be disclosing people's private information. None of us would want that. So the old rule is, don't do to others what you wouldn't want done to yourself. So you wouldn't. If people came in with acquired personal information about yourself, you probably wouldn't want them to go and spreading it around. Although that's very tempting because people like to dish the dirt, and people like to talk about other people. But it's not a good thing. So discreetness. Keep confidences that you acquire in your jobs, and you'll probably be a much more successful person. You'll probably have people who like you much more than if you get a reputation for being loose-lipped. Okay, so anyway, so discretion is an ethical principle, and certainly in certain jobs it's more of an issue than others. Lawyers and accountants are certainly that way because they oftentimes acquire, just by the nature of their work, all kinds of information, juicy information that other people might like to know, but they're obligated not to tell them. So I'm married. My wife sends to me a client, and I learn certain things about the client, and she begins to ask me about the case. I can't tell her much about the case. I usually ask her, well, what did he tell you? Now, if he told her something, I can confirm it. You know, if he said, well, if he said that. But I got to be careful that she's actually being honest with me. So I have to be able to trust her that she's not making up things. Once she learns that I will confirm what she tells me, it might be tempting for her to fish for information that way. So I have to explain to her. I explained to her that I can't give information about these clients, even though they're friends of yours and you sent them to me. You didn't own them, and that doesn't give you any access to what they tell me. Anyway, so you have to be discreet, keeping the confidence of people. Another ethical principle that's important in business, whatever your business is, professional demeanor. That is having the appropriate image. You know, so that's going to be important for your firm and the repeat business that your firm hopes to get, that you look professional when you're doing your job. And even off work, you don't want to look too sloppy, okay? You know, any place, especially, and that's more true in some situations than others. So most lawyers will dress up. And yeah, there's some clientele that are different. So I remember when I was a young lawyer working in a trial court system in a county, working at the local level on criminal cases, and there was a lawyer there. He'd been down there for 30 years. He got hit in the head early on, and he had changed after that. And he began to wear clothes that were very much like his clients. That is, he was representing these criminals, and he would wear a big gold chain around his neck with some sort of gold medallion on the end, and an open shirt, Hawaiian shirt, and loafers, and no tie, no coat of any type. Most of us had, you know, coats. Some of us were better dressed. Some of us maybe were more astute to how to dress really nicely. I was not one of those. I was happy with Sears suits, and cheap suits were fine with me, but I did wear a suit and I wore a tie. And you know, apparently I was very fortunate that I actually fit into off-the-rack suits very well. So I was just the average kind of guy. And so that was, so I always did try to have a professional demeanor. I wanted people to think well of me, but I didn't have the money to really afford better suits. So I, you know, did what I could. So there's nothing wrong with that. Anyway, but this guy was a very successful lawyer, and I understand he's terribly competent, even though he'd been hit in the head. Okay, and that's why how some people explained it. I didn't see it that way. I think he actually decided that his clients liked him to look that way, and that's why he did it. But I don't know what effect it might have on juries, because you know, with my clients, when I went into criminal court, I would tell them, you got to dress up. Don't come into court with your cigarettes rolled up in your sleeve and that tattoo showing. You know, don't do that. And you know, try to have a nice suit if you can, or a nice shirt, and look more innocent. Take that hard look off your face. I remember watching the Tyson trial. I remember here in Indiana where Tyson was being tried for rape, and I looked at the trial, and he had a very, very nice suit, okay? But it wasn't doing him much good because it was almost in some ways too slick. It gave him the appearance of a very rich guy who might be just totally indifferent to other people's fortunes. Or also, but what was really, I think, bad about his demeanor was that he had this very tough look on his face, which I guess is helpful if you're a boxer, and intimidating to people. But you don't want to intimidate the jury. You want them to think you as a nice guy who wouldn't possibly do anything to hurt anybody. Okay, you know. But I don't think his lawyers knew how to counsel him on that, maybe enough, or maybe he just wasn't receptive to the idea of. And maybe it's difficult for him to do, because oftentimes one does take on appearances that are useful to one in one's life, and then you get into the habit of it, and it's difficult to change what you're doing. So if you're going into business, you want to look like you belong there, that you're one of the group who knows that. And in some cases, maybe you know, you might work in a certain field where you can do that. So I understood that oftentimes in the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, that programmers were oftentimes very wild looking. But that was peculiar kind of thing, and that had to do with the boss. This is the way the boss was dressing, so they were, just going away along with the boss. And on the other hand, if your boss is a, buttoned up guy with his ties buttoned down and, and all that, you probably, if you want to keep his respect, you probably want to do that. If your clients are that way, you probably want to do that. Maybe, depending upon your clientele, you need to do that. So professional demeanor is certainly important. You don't want people thinking that you're some sort of a clown, don't know what you're doing, or loose-lipped, and don't take the work seriously. So you see that kind of behavior oftentimes in some movies that are maybe portraying people in a very bad light. And I'm telling you that for the most part, people who are serious about their jobs will avoid looking like a clown or a slouch or a criminal. So you don't want to give off that kind of impression. So it's part of the ethical code in many professions that you do have a professional demeanor, and so the appearance of impropriety is bad. So you need to keep an appropriate image. Objectivity. Objectivity means that you avoid bias, and you avoid the appearance of bias. And bias is very common in our society. We grow up surrounded by it, right? And so we very easily acquire it from others. People who are close to us can very much infect us with a bias, especially when you're young and you don't know any better. And we've all were exposed to this kind of thing. It usually comes from the parents, but it can also come from your playmates. So I remember very much that I was standing on a corner when my dearest and dearest friend, I was only 5 years old, he was 4, and my dearest and dearest friend was running away, and I stopped him and said, "Well, why are you running away?" He said, "Well, that lady got off the bus." I said, "Well, what's wrong with that lady?" He said, "Well, she's black." I said, "Well, so what?" And then, he told me, well, all kinds of bad things. And I thought, well, is that right? And so I had to ask my parents, and they said, no, that was all right. But it's very easy to get infected with bias and prejudice there, And, he was just a kid like myself, and he was doing it because somebody who was an adult told him bad things about them, and he thought they were some sort of criminals. So you find that kids can be easily warped. Anyway, I imagine he may have been changed by now, hopefully. Anyway, objectivity avoids bias, avoids conflicts of interest. So you need to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest. So you're working for somebody. You want them to think that you're working for their benefit, and obviously you're getting paid. So that's nothing wrong with that. But you should not ever compete with them. So we talked, I think, before about conflicts of interest, and you need to maintain an independent point of view in your work. If you're an accountant, certainly, or a lawyer, you need to be independent of your client, and you need to tell your client when you need to be frank with him, right? You need to tell him when he's not right. You need to tell him what the truth is. However, there are very rich people sometimes who will persuade and bully and disfavor people who tell them the truth, and they wind up sometimes getting into trouble. People who could be maybe making a good contribution in the world wind up not being able to do so because they can't take criticism. And so it's very important that a person learns to be what used to be called humble. Now, I believe that there's a place for pride. You should be proud of accomplishments you had. If you got an A in a course, you should be proud of that. If you got a 4.0, you should be proud of that. If you did a good job on something, you should be proud of those things, okay? But you have to be humble, and that humble would be recognizing when you're deficient and being able to admit to it and say, yeah, well, I got a B plus, and I wish I had an A, but gee, I probably deserved a B plus. I probably didn't deserve better than that. That's what the professor said. Okay, I've talked quite a bit about the principles, and now I'd like to talk about some threats to the principle, and then we'll get into some of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley did to kind of answer those threats in regard to the accountings that were going on in the early 2000s, 2001, and in the 1990s. There was a long period of time. Enron didn't fall in a day. It fell and it rose, by misrepresenting his income for over 10 years, and then all those times it was falling more and more behind and becoming less and less valuable, and nobody knew it because they were misrepresenting their income. Anyway, so what are the threats that might get involved, might cause a ethical problem, a threat to these principles that I talked about? One threat is a threat of self-interest. Do you have an interest in your client's business? That is, do you own shares in, or you have some a wife or somebody who works for him? Maybe your wife is on the board of directors for that client. Can you then act independently if you're an auditor? Well, that's another question. Or if you have any sort of business dealings, what can you do? So self-interest can get in the way of the ethical principles. Another threat is self-review. That's where you're checking your own work. Okay, so in some cases it might be for accountants. It was very frequently they were checking the work that was done by their own law firm as consultants, and we'll see that that's one of the things that Sarbanes-Oxley addressed. Self-review, so checking your firm's work and deciding that it's maybe not the right thing for them to be doing, and you're approving of the work because it's done by your guys when you know they didn't do it right. That would be one of the problems, and you can see how that would get in the way. Over-familiarity, extravagant gifts. I mean, one thing that you might have, a client might want to bribe you in a sense, and having you even inviting you to, events, inviting you to go with him on a hunting trip or a fishing trip. He's your client. Why is he doing that? He otherwise doesn't know you, but all of a sudden he's saying, well, you seem like a good Joe, let's go fishing, okay? And maybe you're a person who likes fishing and you want to go fishing, but you might think about it as to how it's going to affect your dealing with him. Will you be able to give him independent advice and good advice that you need to give him? And so self-review is a threat to these principles. Over-familiarity, extravagant gifts, we talked about that. Advocacy, this is kind of the opposite of some things that you might otherwise do. Advocacy, you should never go against your client. You shouldn't act in your own self-interest, certainly. That would be acting against your client. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be sucking up to him either. So advocacy is flattering him, talking to others about him and building him up to others. What are you doing it for? You're sucking up to him? Well, we know how that goes. But that means that you're not going to be much of an independent check on his bad behavior. And in certain jobs like auditing or lawyers or accountants in general, financial advisors, you've got to tell people the hard truth, and therefore you're not in business to have them like you, and so that can get in the way. And you don't want to be feeling too much positively towards them. You want to feel positive towards them, but you don't want to be overly so. So over-familiarity, advocacy, these are things you need to avoid. Intimidation. So some clients will bully accountants. They'll intimidate them. They'll terrorize them. I mean, and they'll do that with others. Some of the tactics of people who harass people is to terrorize them, right? By saying things. You can terrorize people by what you say. So you can have a huge impact, or what you show them and what you laugh about. Bullying, I mean, is very common with certain kinds of personalities. Certain, I think unfortunately a lot of times people who are very much into getting ahead, will bully other people. So it's nothing that really we want to be proud about, and it results in maybe the wrong decision being made. Any kind of undue pressure is intimidation. So you have to avoid doing that and oppose it when you see it. And so sometimes that might mean you need to come to aid in defense of your fellow workers or others, even people who are outside the workplace. Might be a client, it might be a customer, it might be somebody's wife, So you have to be concerned about that. Now there's a proper way of proceeding and you might want to ask their advice in some particular situations as to what you're about. And don't rush in until you know what you're doing, until you've got a really good plan. And so in some cases it's difficult. SOX. So we're going to talk about Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That's SOX. So where you see SOX in my PowerPoints, that's what that means, Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So SOX put in ethical safeguards. So what are we talking about? We're talking about integrated audits, so I'm going to be talking about that. We're talking about independent external auditors. We're talking about CFO and CEO accountability. We're talking about the independent directors that are required under SOX. We're talking about a financial auditing expert on the BOD. That's not BOD, that's Board of Directors, okay? But I needed an abbreviation, otherwise I get too much information on the page. Then we're talking about whistleblower protection, because we want people to be able to somehow safely and freely tell us when things are going wrong in a corporation. We don't want Enron happening again. We don't want people to lose millions of dollars, because even though the people in the firm oftentimes knew that things were not right, nobody knew the scale of it, and it was not widely known how bad it was, and even the people in the firm didn't know all they needed to know. And so whistleblowers, if a number of whistleblowers had told what they knew and had gotten out widely, maybe the thing could have been avoided. But then again, we see that there was a whistleblower, but she was maybe not widely believed, and the firm was able to put on a great PR campaign saying, oh, these people don't know what they're talking about. And so our willingness sometimes to believe lies is amazing. Also, one of the safeguards that they put in, these are soft ethical safeguards, rotation of auditing firms, so you don't have the same auditing firm year after year, with the expectation sometimes by the people who are doing the audit that after they are done with their auditing careers, they can go to work for that client and make money. And this used to be a standard practice, unfortunately, in accounting. I don't know if they're still doing that, but there was concern about that. So rotation of auditing firms at least would make that less likely. Limits of auditors' service as consultants. So one of the big problems with Enron was Arthur Andersen was making huge money off of consulting jobs. And like I said, the auditors couldn't criticize the work of their own firm, and that was a problem. And also, it meant that the whole job was their self-interest was compromising them, right? So, so there was an accountant who pointed out that the accounting was wrong at Enron early on, and he was largely shoved aside by the top management. So the top management wound up, because they were making a lot of money off of Enron, ignoring their best accountant. They knew it was the best point. Did they fire him? No, they didn't fire him, because they knew he was a good accountant. They just put him on a different job. And that was unfortunate, because there are lots of people who got hurt because of that kind of decision. And of course, the head of Arthur Andersen thought he was just being a good doctor. Well, you're not a doctor. You're more like a policeman if you're doing an audit. But you have to understand that. Now, you're not a policeman. You're not going to be putting people in jail, but you have to hold them to standards. So you're more like a traffic cop. So you're blowing the whistle on people at worst, and maybe not even that. You're first telling them what they're doing wrong and trying to get them to do the right thing. And you can do that, because they will do it, because they need your signature on there to sell their stock. And it worked after the 30s for 20, 30, 40 years. We had a period in which we didn't have very much corruption in these things. There were corruption, but there were very few and far between, not like they had been previous to the 30s, and like they became in the 90s. We didn't have that kind of thing going on. So these are ethical safeguards. Limits of auditor service as accountant consultants. So we talked about that. Integrated audit, what is that? In the U.S., audits of publicly traded companies are governed by rules made by the public, the PCAOB, okay, Public Accounting Board, anyway. So it makes the rules, and and it was established by Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and SOX. And such an audit is called an integrated audit, where auditors, in addition to issuing an opinion, on the financial statements. So this was traditional for these public accounting firms to indicate that they thought that the reports were fair and accurate as to the firm's financial situation. So that's what they typically were paying to get, and it was your job ethically and professionally to only give them that if they deserved it and were meeting the standards, and to get them to follow the standards otherwise. And instead, accounting firms became concerned with their clients. That is, they thought their job was to please their clients. Their job was not to please their client. Their job was to get their client to conform and comply with the requirements for accounting properly, so that the public was informed as to the condition of the firm. That was their job. And you might say, well, gee, isn't the customer always right? Not in the accounting profession. They're not always right. They're only right when they are right, and you need to report them if they're not. And you don't actually need to report them oftentimes. There are some times where a professional needs to report somebody for doing something. So if I'm a lawyer and I have a client who tells me he just bought a gun and he's going to go shoot somebody, I have an obligation to tell the police my client's going there. Otherwise, I'm not going to reveal confidence of my clients ever. Even if they did something bad in the past, I'm not going to reveal that. But if they're going to do something in the future and I know about it, I have an ethical obligation to prevent it. And I think the same thing would be true of accountants. When they see that there is misrepresentation to the investors, they need to be telling these investors, or they need to do something to make sure that these reports are filed rightly to the extent they can do so. And they can do a lot. And it worked for 40 years. No sense in saying that it doesn't work. You can do it. Only if you're pussyfoots can you not do it. Will you not do it? You can be whipped by them, right? Okay. So the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. An audit is called an integrated audit, where the auditors, in addition to opinion, must also express an opinion on the effectiveness of the company's internal control over financial accounting. According to my father, they always had done that when he was an accountant, back in those 30 to 40 years after the Great Depression legislation that resulted from the New Deal. That's what they did. And he wasn't necessarily approving of what one of my cousins, one of my favorite cousins, was doing as an accountant. I don't think my cousin ever really understood that. In some ways, he admired my father as a World War II hero and as an accountant of standing, and maybe went into accounting because of him. But my father was disappointed to see him when he talked about some of the things, and said that these accountants were not doing what they used to do. So what the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was maybe bringing in was what accountants used to do, and it worked. But that's that. Anyway, external auditors. An external auditor performs an audit of the financial statements of a company and is independent of the entity being audited. SOX has imposed strong requirements on external auditors and their evaluation of internal controls and financials. So they have to say that they have to sign off that they're being effective. External auditors are liable to third parties' damages by making decisions based on information in audited reports. So, they need to do those audits right. And so that's sometimes you need to make laws when people have shown that there's capacity for people to abuse those laws. You maybe need to make laws, and people hopefully then will comply. But if you just allow people to do anything, well, then you're going to have some of them that do it, and if they start doing it, then the others may well do it because they see them getting away with it, and there's no repercussions, and they actually are losing business to the people who are doing the wrong thing. So that's what happens. Anyway, CFO and CEO accountability. SOX enumerates specific limits on the behaviors of corporate officers and describes specific features of benefits and civil penalties for non-compliance. For example, Section 302 requires that the company's principal officers, that is the CEO and the CFO, certify the chief financial officer and the chief executive officer, certify and approve the integrity of their company's financial reports quarterly. So they have to sign off on them, saying that they've read them and they've examined them and they've taken steps to make sure that they are accurate and that they are reliable, and so they have to sign the statement. which becomes an admission. So they can't go into court and say, well, I didn't know what was going on. I was relying upon my auditors. They've got to be, responsible for their auditors. Whether they hired them outside auditors or whether they're the internal accountants, they're responsible for those people. That's what supervision is. That's why you get paid big bucks, because you're doing these things. Anyway, common law liability. Accountants can be held in common law for being liable, and other people will be held liable for violations sometimes. And oftentimes ethics are discussed in courtrooms. Now, you might say, well, a violation of ethics is not necessarily a violation of law. That's true, but it does play on the jury if they think you're a good guy or a bad guy. And if you can point to a person's ethical failings, then you're putting him in a light that may be difficult for him to escape assumption that he was maybe some sort of innocent when he was doing other things that were wrong, that were not just merely unethical, but were actually illegal. So contract, the accountants can be liable in contract. They can have contract liability. They can also be liable for negligence. We call that malpractice in terms of professional liability. That's malpractice, is what negligence is. If you're careless in doing your job, you're being negligent. Well, for a professional, that's being professionally malpracticed. That's professional malpractice. And fraud. Fraud is a vicious defense. There are numerous difficulties for bringing fraud charges. At common law, you had to prove it by not just more likely than not, you had to prove that it was likely, or it was a standard a little less than the beyond a reasonable doubt, but you had to prove more than just more likely than not. Fraud is, like I said, a vicious kind of thing. There are other provisions about fraud. Anyway, negligence and malpractice. What's an accountant's duty? He has to comply with generally accepted accounting standards, GAAP, and he has to insist on the use of the right generally accepted accounting principles. One of the things in Enron was that they were accounting for themselves as if they were a trading firm, but what they were was a gas and electric firm. They were delivering gas and electricity. They weren't delivering stocks and bonds. They weren't delivering anything other than gas and electricity. And using mark-to-market accounting was not what you use to traditionally account for making profits in their business. So they were misrepresenting their income that way. And they thought they were geniuses because they were doing that. Can you imagine? Anyway, so that kind of points to a lack of educational acumen or common sense, to think that you can just do these things and get away with it. And so take something that's appropriate for some other kind of operation. That's why experience is important. So you learn all about things in school, and you learn and sometimes with experience how things are actually done, and there's something to be gained by experience. Investigation of red flags and disclosure of red flags. Okay. Breach and violations of gas or GAAP, or failing to act on a reasonable competent accountant, then there's monetary losses, and the accountant's going to be liable for that. Let me see if I can get through this. Now I got a number of things here I don't know if I'll get through. I talk about fraud liability, and so fraud, there's actual fraud and constructive fraud, and accountants are jointly and severally liable for fraud, whether it's actual fraud or constructive. Actual fraud is an intent to mislead in order to perpetrate a fraud. Constructive fraud arises where the accountant has acted with reckless disregard, in other words, with gross negligence, in performing an audit or preparing a financial statement. So you could be found, and you can imagine this is very bad for the client, the accountant's reputation. They live and exist by their reputation for coming back with an honest accounting of the facts. Accountants are jointly and severally liable for frauds and negligence and malpractice. So, if they have an old, that is under the old standard where they had just ordinary partnerships. Nowadays, of course, with LLCs, we know that actually a lot of them are not jointly and severally liable. So we talked about that earlier. Liability under 1933 Act. liability for misstatements or omissions in registration statements, liability for misstatements or omissions in other communications in an offer. Liability under 34, there's section 18 liability for misleading in certain SEC documents. So you also have liability for misstatements or omissions in any oral or written statements. Tort reform. Now, you know, I didn't talk about the criminal liability that you could get, but obviously it played a big role in Enron, where the CEOs of the firm and the chairman of the board and others went to jail for considerably long times. So you're talking about 20 years, and you know, for the CEOs. Anyway, tort reform, 1994, Supreme Court rewrote the law and relieved accountants of aiding and abetting liability. 1995, Congress passed the PSLRA, relieving accountants of joint and several liability for negligence and requiring special pleading standards for Social Security. So we've been doing tort reform for some time. Sarbanes reaction, prohibition of auditors of a publicly traded company from simultaneously doing audits and consulting contracts for the same client. So there was a lot of cutback on consulting because that had corrupted actually Arthur Andersen. Requires audit partners to rotate every 5 years. We mentioned that. Make it unlawful for publicly traded firms to do an audit of the CEO, CFO, CAO, or controller who was previously employed by the auditor. Okay, if you know, so like I said, you have to rotate them. Requires public accounting to make timely reports to audit committees. Thank you very much, and I hope you found this enlightening. I found it enlightening to study the whole Enron affair and to write on it, which I did. So I had papers on it, which were published in, you know, in not journals, but in the proceedings papers where I went. And I'm not an accountant, but I think I began to understand it a lot. And I have to say that I learned a lot from my accounting professors, and I learned a lot from my father and my cousin. Okay, so I hope you benefit from this. I'm not trying to scare you with this, but I'm saying that as a profession, whatever profession you're in, if you're a lawyer, you're an accountant, if you're some other profession, dentist, anything that you're in, you need to do it right. Otherwise, people will not want to come to you, and that's going to be bad for business.